A few months after my mother passed away, the house fell into an unsettling quietness. It was as though the walls themselves mourned her absence. My father and I rarely exchanged more than the usual greetings and small talk about household chores. I assumed we were both grieving in our own way, yet neither of us knew how to bridge the distance between us. One evening, as I sat flipping through old photo albums, memories of her flooded back. Her laughter seemed to echo from the images, her eyes sparkling even in the faded pages. The silence around me was so heavy that I almost didn't hear my father enter the room. He spoke gently, his voice a mix of sadness and tenderness. Looking through old memories, he asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak, fearing my voice would break. He sat beside me, closer than he had in months, and took the album from my hands. We were lucky to have her, he said, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the face of my mother in one of the pictures. She was everything to me. A lump formed in my throat. To me too, I whispered. We sat together in silence for what felt like an eternity, flipping through the pages. I hadn't realized how much I missed this connection, the simple act of sitting side by side and sharing a moment. It reminded me of the times when our family was whole, before everything changed. After a long pause, my father spoke again. I know I haven't been the best father lately. I've been lost without her. I'm sorry if I've made you feel alone. His words struck me deeply. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear them until that moment. It's been hard for both of us, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. But I don't blame you, Dad. A faint smile tugged at his lips, and the lines on his face seemed to soften. You're more like her than you realize, he said, his voice trailing off. Kind, forgiving. For a moment, I thought he might cry, but instead, he placed his hand gently on mine. I don't want to lose you too. The sincerity in his eyes was overwhelming. I squeezed his hand, trying to reassure him. You won't. From that evening on, things between us began to shift. My father started making more of an effort, cooking dinner, asking about my day, even joining me for walks in the park. It was comforting, but also unsettling in ways I couldn't quite explain. He was more attentive than ever, as though he were trying to fill the void my mother had left. His presence seemed heavier, but not in an oppressive way. It was as if he was trying to make up for the emotional distance that had grown between us over the months. I began to notice the small, subtle gestures, how he would pause and wait for me to finish speaking, how he started leaving my favorite snacks on the kitchen counter, how he would ask if I wanted to watch a movie together in the evenings. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, we were both trying to adjust to life without Mom. We needed to support each other however we could. But then, something happened that made me uneasy. One evening, I came downstairs to find Dad sitting on the couch, flipping through TV channels. He looked up when he heard me, his face lighting up with a warm smile. Hey, why don't you join me? We haven't done this in a while, he suggested, patting the seat beside him. I hesitated, an unfamiliar discomfort crawling up my spine. I had gotten used to sitting across the room during these moments, but tonight felt different. His invitation wasn't casual. It almost felt like an unspoken plea for closeness. I sat down beside him, trying to ignore the strange feeling in my gut. As we watched the movie, his arm brushed against mine. He tried to be subtle, but the touch lingered longer than it should have. I stiffened, unsure of how to respond. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake, that it was all in my head. After all, we were grieving. This was probably his way of seeking comfort, right? But the next day, it happened again. This time, we were sitting at the kitchen table when he handed me a cup of coffee. His fingers brushed mine, and they lingered for a moment too long. When I looked up, I saw something in his eyes, something I had never seen before. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds, the air between us thick and charged, as though we were both holding our breath. I'm sorry, he said quickly, pulling his hand back and flushing slightly. He looked away, avoiding my gaze. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. My heart pounded in my chest. It's fine, Dad, I managed to say, though I wasn't entirely sure it was. That afternoon, I went for a long walk, trying to clear my head. My thoughts were consumed with what had happened. Was I overreacting? Or was there something more to his behavior? When I returned home, I found Dad sitting in the living room, staring out the window. He looked lost, as though he was battling something within himself. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to ask him about the incident, to gain some clarity, but another part of me was afraid of what he might say. I stood there for a moment before finally speaking. "Are you okay?" I asked hesitantly. He turned to face me, his expression soft but weary. "I'm just trying to figure things out," he said quietly. "I know this has been hard for both of us. I just don't know how to make it right." There was something in his voice, something raw and vulnerable, that made me want to comfort him, to tell him that it was okay, that we could find a way through this. But the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. In the days that followed, I found it harder and harder to ignore the growing tension between us. Every time Dad got too close, my heart would race, and I couldn't help but feel like something was shifting between us, something I didn't understand. A few days later, I was sitting at my desk, trying to study, when Dad knocked softly on my door. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked, his voice low, laced with an undercurrent of tension. I set my pen down and nodded, my stomach tightening. He sat down on the edge of my bed, his hands clasped together as if to keep them from trembling. "I know things have been strange," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened lately, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." His words hung in the air between us, but the unease in my chest grew with each passing second. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't tell if it was just grief clouding my judgment, or if there was something more beneath the surface. I stared at my father, unsure of how to respond. The last few days had been a tangled web of unspoken words and confusing gestures. The silence between us was heavy, as though everything had changed, but no one dared to address it directly. "I've been trying so hard to keep it together for you," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, as though the weight of his own sorrow was threatening to overwhelm him. "But I think I might be making things worse. I'm sorry if I've overstepped. I don't know how to cope without your mom, and I've found myself leaning on you more than I should." His words sent a pang through my chest, a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. I understood the depth of his grief, but there was something in the way he was looking at me now that felt different from the fatherly love I had always known. It was as if he was searching for something in me, something that wasn't just a daughter's comfort. "I understand, Dad," I said, my voice a bit shaky. "I know it's been hard for both of us, but we have to be careful, okay? I don't want to feel like I'm the one holding everything together." "I know," he replied quietly, his voice full of remorse. "I don't want to make you feel like that. It's just, sometimes, it feels like you're all I have left." His words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I didn't know how to respond to them without sounding cold or distant. I didn't want to push him away, but at the same time, I wasn't sure how to help him without compromising my own comfort, my own sense of security. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. My father became more and more attentive, his presence almost overwhelming. He checked in on me constantly, offering help with tasks I didn't need help with, and stepping into my space in ways that made me uneasy. Every time I tried to pull away, he seemed to step closer. Whether it was standing a little too close while I was cooking or offering to walk me to school in the mornings, it felt like he was trying to fill a gap that I couldn't quite understand. One afternoon, as I sat reading in the living room, he came in and sat beside me. This time, he didn't say anything. He simply sat there, his shoulder brushing against mine. The warmth of his body next to mine felt too close, too much, and once again that unsettling feeling washed over me. His proximity wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I need to go for a walk," I said, my voice shaking. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure? You don't have to go." "I'm fine, Dad," I interrupted, desperate to escape the tension. "I just need some space." I left the house quickly, stepping out into the cool air in an attempt to clear my head. But the walk did little to calm me. My thoughts were consumed with what had been happening. I couldn't stop thinking about my dad's behavior. The way he touched me, the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to be searching for something that wasn't just a daughter's affection. I wondered if I was now the one filling the void my mother had left. And if I was, what did that mean for us? The days that followed were filled with confusion and self-reflection. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain it. My dad continued his efforts to reconnect with me, but his actions, while kind, started to feel more and more unsettling. It was as if he was grasping for something he couldn't name, and in the process, I was losing myself. One evening, after I returned from another walk, I found my dad waiting for me in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, his hands folded in his lap, as though he had been deep in thought for a long time. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said as soon as I walked in, his voice serious. "I know I've been different lately, and I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I think I've realized something." I stayed silent, unsure of where this conversation was headed. The way he spoke felt heavy, as though something significant was about to be revealed. "I've been trying to make up for everything I lost," he continued, his voice softer now, as though he was speaking from a place of vulnerability. "But I've been leaning on you too much. You're not Mom, and I've been asking things of you that aren't fair. I'm sorry if I've made you feel like I was expecting something from you that wasn't right." His words settled around me like a heavy weight, and for the first time, I felt a surge of relief mixed with lingering confusion. He had finally acknowledged it, finally recognized that his actions had crossed a line, even though he hadn't meant to. "I don't want to lose you too," he said quietly, his voice raw. "But I know I need to find a way to heal without relying on you in ways I shouldn't." In that moment, I finally felt like we were on the same page. The tension that had been building between us began to dissolve, and I felt a shift in the way I viewed him. His grief had been consuming, and while it had led him to seek comfort in ways that I couldn't fully understand, I now realized he wasn't trying to replace Mom. He was just lost, just as I was. "We'll get through this," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We both will. But we have to heal in our own way. Together, but separately." Dad nodded, his face softening for the first time in months. The weight that had been pressing on him seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, he looked like a father again, vulnerable, yes, but trying to do what was best for both of us. From that moment on, things began to improve. We found a new rhythm, one that allowed space for both of us to grieve in our own way without crossing boundaries. There were still hard days, days when the absence of Mom felt more pronounced than ever, but we learned to lean on each other in healthier ways. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a way forward that honored Mom's memory and allowed both of us to heal without the weight of unspoken expectations. In that healing, I found something crucial. I realized that while we might never fully understand everything that happened in the wake of Mom's passing, we could still move forward with love, with respect, and with a renewed sense of connection.